Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and today I want to talk to you about catastrophic thinking, otherwise known as catastrophization. We are always trying to make sense of our experience and understand what's going on. So catastrophic thinking is when there's a situation or circumstance that you perceive to be a negative one, and your mind takes it to the worst case scenario. It turns it into a catastrophe. Catastrophic thinking is a big part of the binge eating cycle. It's those thoughts that say, I'm a complete failure. I'm never going to be able to get better. Other people can do it, but I can't. I'm the worst binge eater in the world. And these catastrophic thoughts create these big emotional responses. So when our thoughts are catastrophizing and our emotions are up, we lose perspective, and then we can feel even more out of control of our behavior around food. One of the ways the catastrophic thinking perpetuated my binge eating would be I was constantly trying to eat in a certain way, a more controlled way. And so I would tell myself, okay, today I'm only going to eat these things, or quite often it was, I'm not going to eat any sugar. And then the minute I felt like I'd gone over this line, this bar that I'd set for myself, my mind would go, oh no, I've blown it. I might as well just eat everything. I'll try again tomorrow. And it just had this catastrophic response. This is what happens in the Last Supper eating, which can be triggered by saying to yourself, these are the rules. And the minute you break a rule, you think, well, I might as well just eat everything in sight now because tomorrow I'm going to do better. Well, then what can we do about it? So I've put together 5 tips to manage this catastrophic thinking. I want to begin by saying I think it's a really human thing to do, and everybody probably does it to some degree. But if we can manage this catastrophic thinking, we can calm ourselves down enough to retain perspective, to be able to think. Because when the system, that's us, when we get stressed out, our lower brain becomes very active and our prefrontal cortex becomes less active. That's those moments where it doesn't even feel like you're making the decision. The binge is just happening. And the first thing that we need to do, if there's anything that we want to change, is we need to practice recognizing it. Now, when you are in catastrophic thinking, you don't know you're catastrophizing. You think you're realizing something true. You think you're realizing that, yes, things are never going to change. You think you're realizing that you were deluding yourself earlier when you thought things could possibly be different or you could do anything differently. So when we start to recognize it, chances are we're going to be recognizing it retrospectively. So don't give yourself a hard time if you go away from this video thinking, right, I'm going to look out for my catastrophic thinking, and you miss it in the moment. You practice catching it afterwards. You go, oh, earlier, that was some catastrophic thinking that was going on, and just labeling it and naming it. And the more often you do that as you're coming down from the catastrophic thinking, the more likely you are to be able to catch it in the moment. So for me now, if I have a catastrophic thought reaction to something, it will happen like that. But I'm catching it sooner and sooner. So in order to recognize, journaling might be helpful. Putting words down, recognizing what are the catastrophic thoughts that come up again and again. Because if you're in the cycle of binge eating, there's probably going to be about half a dozen that show up a lot. And if you can recognize them ahead of time, you'll have more luck catching them in the moment. And the second point I want to make is to think about the emotional response that's going to happen. So when we're catastrophizing, our bodies respond. We have this mind-body connection. So our bodies respond to what's going on in the mind. Sometimes our mind is responding to what's going on in the body. So it's a bit of a loop. So we need to have a think about how to calm the system. Some of you might have a very anxious, panicked response to catastrophization, and others might sink into like a low mood and a despair. Anything that involves getting up and moving the body. It shifts, it changes your heart rate when you're moving. It might speed it up, might slow it down depending on the type of movement you're doing. This isn't about, oh, go and exercise your problems away. But there is something to do with that embodiment that comes from moving our bodies. Some people like things like breath work or grounding techniques. It's recognizing there's something here, anxiety, depression, despair, fear, and I want to move that emotion through the system. Changing our physical state can help calm the mind. So I know it's really basic to say things like, go for a walk. That is an option. I'm not saying all your problems will go away if you just go for a walk, but what I'm saying is that kind of movement, that bilateral movement, helps to calm the mind down. So if we calm the body, we help to calm the mind. And there are loads of things you can Google around grounding techniques and things like that that might help you to gather a few ideas about how you might do this, what's going to work for you depending on your particular emotional response. The third point I want to make, this one was a biggie for me, is this idea of being willing to be wrong. Because in that moment, the catastrophic thinking is convinced that it is right. And chances are it will hook into old belief systems as well. So if your catastrophic thinking takes you to that I'm a failure, I'm the worst person in the world kind of place, it's going to feel even more compelling if that is part of your experience and that is a thought that comes up for you in all other areas of your life. So it's not convincing yourself when you're catastrophizing that this isn't a catastrophe. But it's when you recognize it's going on in the moment, it's introducing some doubt. Am I willing to be wrong about this? So when I say to myself that I'm this and I'm that, I'm putting all these labels on myself, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm not a failure just because I've made this mistake? Catastrophic thinking wants to bring all the mistakes you've ever made in your life to prove that you are a failure. But really the catastrophic thinking has been triggered off by one thing that may have been a slip or may just have been you not reaching this bar that you set for yourself that might not have been realistic to begin with. If we remove this idea that we can be certain about what something means, we open up possibilities. And that can feel really uncomfortable to begin with, because particularly if we're stressed or agitated, we want certainty. We would rather be right and miserable, maybe because we place so much meaning on what being right means. If we have misinterpreted everything and we got it wrong, now we'll shame ourselves for getting it wrong. And it's not about a right or wrong. Most things do not have an inherent objective meaning. So whether you've binged or not doesn't mean you have failed or succeeded in any kind of objective way. We make our meaning, we choose our meaning, but if it's happening automatically, we're not really choosing it. But when we recognize that we're just making meaning automatically, then we can question it. So we can go, hang on a second, this is not me here and now, grounded, considering this situation and trying to make sense of it. This is a catastrophic response. The fourth point I want to make is that you need to be honest and kind. And this can be tricky. Sometimes people think self-kindness is letting themselves off the hook because they're missing the honesty part. And the honesty part is you've got your mind spinning these catastrophic thoughts. You've got these emotions swirling because of the catastrophic beliefs. So sometimes when people try to not catastrophize a binge, for example, after a binge, they'll just go, okay, well, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to forget about that and I'm going to focus on this thing over here. They're not being honest with their response or how they feel about the fact they just binged. Most people after a binge, there's going to be some emotions around. And if we ignore those emotions, they tend to come out in other ways. So the honesty part is being honest about how we feel in that moment. So if the shame is there, naming it. I'm experiencing shame. I'm experiencing fear. I'm experiencing despair. I'm experiencing disgust. And I use the word experiencing because it's not who you are. It's an emotional experience you're having. But I think if we are honest about how we feel without resisting those feelings, they come, they swell, and they go on their way. Unless the catastrophic mind keeps spinning stories about the feelings, that's what keeps them going round and round, like they're never going to go anywhere. Even when I was feeling shame, it was hard for me to admit I was feeling shame because I felt like even admitting I was feeling shame was somehow a kind of failure. So I was always trying to run away from it and it just kept chasing after me. When I started becoming more honest with myself about my shame and kind to myself about the fact I was experiencing the shame, that's when it reduced and I experience much less of it now. And the last point that I want to make is don't catastrophize. Catastrophization. Because it's like a trigger response. This is just something that happens. If your brain is used to catastrophizing particular scenarios, it's going to want to go to that place automatically. So the goal may not even be to never catastrophize. It's just going to be to recognize it, to be able to calm the system down, to be willing to be wrong and to be honest and kind with yourself in that moment. I think catastrophization is very human. We're all bimbling along in this world where we feel pretty out of control. We're trying to make sense of things. And it feels more dangerous, perhaps, to say that something is okay and to realize that we were wrong and it was actually terrible than to say something was terrible when maybe it's okay. Or not even okay, but not as catastrophic as our mind is telling us that it is. I think catastrophization comes from our conditioning. So this is old stuff. If your response to something that's happening in the moment is proportionate, that's probably you, as opposed to old things. But of course, who gets to decide what proportionate is, right? I don't know. And I just want to add something on the sort of being willing to be wrong part. That used to feel so threatening to me, to be wrong, because my identity was so invested in being right. And actually, I have found it to be the greatest liberation of any self-development work I've done. Because for as long as we think we know, nothing can change, and we can't change. And then the irony was realizing I didn't have to change was then what enabled me to make some changes. But I get it, it can feel like there's so many different parts of this to watch. If you're feeling really stuck because there's just so much stuff that you're trying to apply all at once, you might want to check this video out here. It's all about being stuck and how you might start to get unstuck. But anyway, hope this was helpful. Thank you for watching. See you on the next video.